Good evening. I am Alicia Batillo, and welcome to the panel discussion on hidden bias. We just finished watching the hidden bias special of Good People, and there's a lot to unpack there. But before we get started, I wanted to introduce our incredible panel. You all have been working with us for months here as a part of the diversity committee. So if you guys just want to wave or smile when I introduce you all. So first I want to introduce Vida Lin, the head of the Asian Community Development Council. And then there's Vida. Thank you so much for joining us. Javon Johnson, UNLV African Studies professor. You all have seen him many times before. Dorinda Burnett, the president of Las Vegas Hawaiian Civic Club. Doreen Hall, president of Hawaiian Civic Club as well. Peter Guzman, you've seen him before, president of Latin Chamber of Commerce. And then the Ruben De Silva, history teacher at Rancho, former congressional candidate, and he's very well known throughout the Hispanic community. And then Petrania Bullswain, founder and owner of Petrania Media LLC. Thank you all so much for joining this important conversation as we continue to move the Valley forward. The first question, and I'll just open the floor to everyone. How did you all feel, quite frankly, about that special that we just watched?
Alicia. So, I'm born in Hawaii, raised in Hawaii, but relocated here in Nevada. And when I was posed a question earlier this morning, I said, no, I've never experienced bias. However, after watching Dr. Mark's webinar, yes, I've experienced it. I judge people. So it was a very interesting segment as we look at ourselves.
Javon, what about you? How did you feel watching the special? Did it speak to you? Do you feel like Dr. Marks made good points? Do you think we have we do have a lot of work to do, but how did you feel watching that?
I think it's readily apparent by most people who know me that I am not a fan of unconscious bias training. There's little, I've not seen one study to say that the training actually works. And I know Professor Marks has said something to the tune of, it depends on what you define as work. Well, if we're saying we're going to train people to not be racist, there is no evidence that I've ever read that says that unconscious bias training works. I am not a fan of it. I listen to this with my whole heart and mind completely open, but there was no argument that was made for me to suggest that this kinds of training works at all. I could go down the list, but I always get hesitant of taking up too much time and speaking at once. But one of the just sort of major things that people choose to be biased. And we're forgetting that very truth, that for some people, their biases actually make their lives better, right? And how do you train that away? That people who actively are conscious making choices. In fact, psychology has shown that more people are acting on conscious bias than actually unconscious. But I can go on for years, my issues with the training, but
yeah. And I want you to, we want to talk about bias training and if it works or it doesn't work. And I saw Peter, I'm going to jump back to you, Javon, but I saw Peter shaking his head. Do you agree or don't agree?
Yeah, as painful, it's somewhat painful for me to have to agree with it, but I do agree with it. I didn't relate very much with it. And the whole training thing, my heart's telling me that doesn't work. When for example, when a young teenager tells me, I can't wait to make some money, be successful so I can move out of this neighborhood, and then moves away forever. How do you train that young man to think differently, that maybe keeping the dollars in the community? And I don't know if the training part works. Maybe I believe more in mentoring or just different type of life experiences and skills, but I can't relate to the bias training.
I'm going to get to, I want to ask Petrania, you used to be a former journalist. So how did you feel? Did you go through bias training yourself?
Yeah, so I used to be a former anchor and reporter at one of the stations here in Las Vegas, and I worked across the country as well. But I don't think I really got into this topic much until after I left working in full-time journalism. But I think as a journalist, this would have been really important. I don't know if I see it as training. I think this is something that's something good for us to all think about, right? Because this is a lot of information if you've just been watching the last hour. First of all, my first takeaway is that he was speaking for 1 full hour, just straight on, which to me, I was very impressed that he was able to do that. But at the same time, it's a lot of information that for people to absorb in a short amount of time. It's a lot of complex information, a lot of things for people to think about. And I think this is the kind of thing that you need to kind of really take some time to study and to think about yourself. But I think it's a good thing that Channel 13 is bringing this up, at least for people to be aware that this thing called unconscious bias or implicit bias exists, right? I think a lot of people never thought about it. They were like, bias is a bad thing, but they're like Javon was saying, conscious bias, but there's also unconscious bias, which according to Dr. Marks, everybody has. Everybody has this implicit and conscious bias. So it can be good and it can be bad. And I think, what we're here to do is just talk about how we feel and maybe the biases we felt, we've gone through, the experience, my experience as a journalist and things I've said maybe, or I've done as a journalist that I think can really be very powerful, because why you're doing this is because what you're putting on the air, Channel 13, any other TV stations, is, it makes an impact, right? What we put out there, the perceptions that we're creating for our viewers, I think that's really important. So to me, I think it's an important conversation. How people take it, I think it's another thing. So I would be interested to hear what the other people on the panel has to say.
That's why it was a little painful for me, because I don't want to knock this down, because I think it's a great step that has been taken. I think it's great to start conversations, but when you ask me an honest question, I just have to go by my life experiences and how I feel. I didn't connect. I don't see myself connecting to the training part of this thing.
Well, first of all, hello, everyone. Todd Quinones here. It wouldn't be a Zoom call without some kind of technical problems, so excuse my delay here. I'm so grateful to all of you again to donating your time and expertise for what I think and what KTNV thinks is a very, very important conversation. Let me just ask from the beginning, isn't this good in terms of information? People may be aware now of what hidden bias is, whereas beforehand, they didn't. And isn't that a good thing? I have to ask you, Ruben.
I think my microphone is on now. Yeah, to actually answer both the questions that were initially asked, I personally think I have a background, as a person who's really worked in only 2 major jobs in my life, and both of them were government institutions. One, a school district, where I've been teaching for 8 years now, and the other one is the United States military, where I served in the United States Marine Corps. And these sort of trainings are things that we do pretty much every year. And the one thing that I will say, and why I appreciate these sort of trainings, is really the fact that some of the best conversations that I had about race, diversity, equity issues with my coworkers or my fellow Marines were immediately after these sort of trainings or during the question and answer session. It felt open. We had an opportunity to have an actual professional there to actually conversations and to serve as a moderator. And I found those to be extremely beneficial because, being a person of color, there was always this underlining, we live in this world where we know that we are being viewed in a different way, implicitly or explicitly. And I found the opportunities to have those conversations immediately post-training as very beneficial in my own experience.
But Ruben, was that because of training, or was that because you're in a room full of, diversity, diverse minds? Having those conversations. I've had those conversations with folks, and it wasn't coming out of a training.
Yeah, but I'll give you my example. When I was in the Marine Corps, there's a lot of issues there when it comes to race, and now there's an actual investigation, in regards to having extremism and white supremacists, who are actively serving in the in our military. That's happening right now as we're speaking. And those were opportunities where we could actually have these conversations. And yes, they weren't the best or easiest to have. They were oftentimes, kind of nasty even. But there were opportunities for us to have those discussions with folks that we served with. This is a difficult topic to discuss. And, sometimes the conversations would be at bars or things like that, or after, in more social settings. But to have professional opportunity to have this discussion in a professional setting, I think is beneficial.
Can we go to get Vita in real quick? I'm sorry, Vita.
Yeah, so I grew up all my life with this bias. Here I am an Asian woman. I grew up where racism, or we're taught that we're living in a certain area. I grew up where we had to be in the back of the bus. I grew up where you could only live in this area because this is where the Asian lives, or this is where the people of color lives, right? So for us to talk about it is important. What I learned from this topic, or this person that spoke, Dr. Mark, was that I always said that this country is built of immigrants. And when he said that this country is built nation of foreigners, except for the Native American, that something that I will change in my talk in the future. But this bias, I grew up with bias all the time. We know to accept it, but let's bring it out and talk about, we do have these bias. What are we going to do about some of to understand how everyone's going, what everyone's going through with the bias, and how do we accept it and educate, right? So that's how I did learn a lot from this conversation earlier today.
Well, I wanted to follow up on Vita here. I think the reason we hear it, maybe people who are watching and listening to us, is what's the goal of us talking about this? What's the goal of Channel 13 bringing this up, right? What's the goal of putting this out? Are we trying to get more people in our community to be more inclusive, to think about other people, to think about the information that we're putting out there? Because everybody can put information out there, not just journalists. We're all citizen journalists putting stuff out on social media every day. Are we thinking about what we're putting out there, the words we're using, the images we're using? Can we be more careful? Can we be more empathetic towards other people who are not like us, right? To me, I think that's the goal of what this show is about, what this conversation is about. So I think we need to make it clear why we're talking about this and why it's important for people to understand, the message that you're trying to put out there.
I agree. I want to go to Dr. Johnson. He put a question in the chat, and I think it's important that he explains the difference between bias, training, and race, correct? Is that what you were?
Yeah, something to the tune of that. So Todd asked, is this conversation important, right? And a conversation is fundamentally different than a training, fundamentally different than a testing. But in this conversation that we're having right now, we're seemingly conflating the terms. Conversations about race are necessary, right? Sexism, all the other problematic isms, those are necessary. I'm not even opposed to the unconscious bias training, even though it's based on IAT, which Dr. Marks mentioned, and that's built on faulty sort of science, right? And I could critique that to the cows come home. What I am saying is the unconscious bias training, those are fundamental things. Training towards what and training out of what, right? And I don't want to do the work of conflating that with, let's say, Rubin's very necessary conversations about race in the Marine Corps. That's not training, those are conversations, right? And then what happens after that? Now, the goal of training is to ultimately achieve something, correct? What is therefore being achieved? If Rubin some years ago was in the Marine Corps and they had a series of unconscious bias trainings, and yet the Marine Corps is still dealing with white supremacy run rampant throughout it, that means the training by definition did not work. However robust those conversations were. And they may have been robust and beneficial, but also to Peter's point really quickly, when he mentions the young kids that he works with who want to make money and move out, that is a conscious choice they're making. But what he's pointing to is they're moving towards structure, sort of areas that are better structured for them. right? And so what we're getting at, and what I want people to always think through is, for me, unconscious bias training treats racism as a personal issue, does little to deal with the sort of systemic and structural issue that would make certain areas less desirable to put your money in to begin with. So I need us to understand that there's a fundamental difference between all three of those terms. Training, testing, and having conversations about race are not always the same thing. In fact, they often compete.
And so what is the solution to that? I mean, what do we do? If you don't feel like the training works, what does work?
Yeah, what works is changing structures and systems. So the first thing I always tell people is, if you believe in racism, we have to believe it's structural, period, right? So what I mean by that is, when Professor Marx mentioned that Black folks get different percentages on their home loans, he is truthful in that fact. It is also exists in a long history of racialized housing practices that categorically deny Black people wealth. My feeling about Black people is irrelevant. What is relevant is that we have been denied wealth building in this country. That's a structural problem. So there needs to be structural solutions. You can't fix a broken arm with a Band-Aid. You need to go and fix the structure of the arm. And so for me, that's policies and public practices that are laws that are put in place, both legal, both at workplaces, policies, rules, that makes racism, that makes problematic isms so uncomfortable that people choose not to do them. Simply put, and I'm going to give this last really quick example, if it makes sense for my neighborhood to not have Black people in it so that my property value can go up, many people are gonna choose that option because I need the money for my children, for my legacy. We need to change rules and laws and policies and procedures. It's a structural issue. No other answer is going to solve for that.
I agree.
But my question, though, real quick, though, I have to interject, is, so you believe that Dr. Marx's intent with this was training and not a conversation? Go ahead, Peter.
Yeah, that's what he said. It's unconscious bias training. That was his language.
You don't see a benefit to having a conversation from his training?
I have an issue with the concept of training, right? Period. It does not work. Now, if we want to have a racial conversation and people want to involve themselves in that, that's fine too. But the problem is that there is a history of scholars doing the work that tells us what the answers are. And the answers are structural. But that's uncomfortable for a lot of people because that's hard, long labor. That's a different kind of labor, right? Than to just say 1 hour.
Years, decades of structure.
Not even years, years, sure, but it's not as easy.
Laws, though.
But it's not as. What I'm trying to get away from is moving away from this idea that an hour training saves us. It does not.
Okay, Peter.
And I agree with that. It's listen. I'm not trying to downplay conversations. We need to have conversations, but the reality is we need real structural change in order to generate generational wealth, in order for Latinos to get, their piece of the pie. So I'm going through this with lending right now. Okay, there's a group that wants to shut down payday loans. I get it. But their way of doing that is by shutting payday loans down, but not listening to me when I say to them, Latinos aren't getting loans at the big traditional banks. They're not getting the $2,000 loans that might help them get through a payroll and keep people employed. So we can have conversations, but I want structural change. I want the big banks to lend money to minorities.
I get what you and Peter and Javon, I get what you're saying. I want to hear from others too. But my biggest issue with this conversation is that we know what needs to be fixed. Starts from the top. Okay, but how do local people like you and I, professors, teachers, what do we do? How do we change what we want to see? That's my question. That's what I'm asking, because I don't know.
Well, I think we have to have a voice at the table. I think that is the first thing, to be that voice, whether all of us need to be at a position where we can make that voice come about. I know Vita and her work at the Asian Community Development Council really trying to advocate, educate, and empower Asian American people to maybe make a decision to go run for office, be at the point where you can make a difference and make your voices heard, right? I think that's the first step. We can be in any different industries, but we need to be somewhere where it makes a difference, and we can make that structural change to impact different groups like Latinx, African American, Asian American. If we're not there, if I'm not here right now speaking for Asian American Pacific Islander community, Vita's not here, who's going to be speaking for us, right? So I think it's important to have that voice out there other than just, the typical norm. So I don't know. I think that's one way that we can start as a local person.
And I'm curious, Doreen, you're hearing this, and what are some of your thoughts?
I can only speak for myself as a Native Hawaiian or as my group here. We advocate Hawaiian traditions and our beliefs. And, these questions are big questions that it may be impossible to answer. Racism, bias or not being biased. And, with our community, it goes down to the roots. It goes down to how were you raised? What did you see as a parent? Was your parent racist? Were they biased? I mean, those are big questions to ask. Are we going to be able to fix it today? Probably not, right? And yes, we do have to be the voices of our community to fight for everything that we deserve. Not only as a white person or black person, just as a person in general. And just like the Hawaiian community, that every other race here represented, we have issues. And we constantly have to fight. And where is a solution? We know we have to be the voice to get to the top, to enact policies, to advocate for what we believe in, what was rightfully taken away from us, whether it's racism or bias. It's a tough question to answer. And we try to survive day by day. But for us, as being a Native Hawaiian, it goes down to the roots. I'm teaching my next generation what it is to be a person, not to look at color, because I wasn't raised that way, right? So for me personally, it's how your foundation is, how you parent, how you raise your child to be a productive adult.
Go ahead, Ruben, you have your hand up.
Have bias, but bias is
I'm sorry.
Right? Bias is being natural, because at one point I'm judgmental, but did we realize it in this conversation tonight? Yeah, it made me aware. Because I first answered the question, no, I'm not biased. I'm trying to be a positive person. But as Dr. Marks did in his conversation, yeah, I'm guilty of being biased, and I'm pretty sure everybody else in this panel has at one point in their life. So it's a very interesting topic, Alicia. It's just a tough question to answer.
Okay, go ahead, Ruben.
Yeah, so I can speak to this as a teacher. I work with primarily 11th graders. I teach U.S. history, and I do involve these sort of conversations in my teaching. One way that I do it, there's two ways. One is that I do encourage the having of these sort of conversations in our classrooms, having conversations about race, having conversations about the role of race in the actual history of the United States, and making it pretty evident in my own classroom curriculum. And then secondly, I 100% agree with Professor on this, and is the fact that racism is structural. The issue, all the academic record points to the fact that race is within the very operating structures of this country, whether it's political, economic, social, cultural, whatever. And the only way to actually deal with it is to directly address it and to tackle it through policy and even protest. And the other thing that I do as a teacher is that I encourage my students and actually create opportunities for them to get involved in public life. I take them to city town halls. My own students have hosted with help from other staff protests on the corner of Searles and Bruce. It's been covered by the news as dealing with DACA and about school shooting, things like that, things that affect them. So I strongly, as a teacher, encourage, first and foremost, having these conversations, as difficult as they may be, as emotional as they are even. I've had criticism from parents, for it. But on the same, and I also, believe that it is in the end a structural issue that has to be dealt with through direct action, and I really impart that upon my students.
And that's part of that big structural changes that we need. Last year, I had a very high wealth a Hispanic individual. I won't say his name, of course, but he got involved with me, and there's different ways of protesting. And his way of protesting was he pulled $11 million out of a bank, and it made it all the way to the top and made people really, really want to have a conversation. And that's the kind of stuff we need to do as far as Latinos. We need to cause structural big changes. And you do that through finances, through politics, things that we're talking about here.
Dr. Johnson, do you agree with that? Do you agree with his way? What Peter just said?
Certainly, right? But again, I think what Peter is pointing to is what an individual can do to spur structural change, right? Which is sort of what answering your question earlier, right? What can we do, right? And certainly there are things that individuals can do. What Peter has sort of mentioned, what Ruben mentioned, right? What does it mean to teach, right? What does it mean to educate, to have conversations, to get children or students out into the streets, right? Protest is a fundamental part of democracy, right? The ability to free speech, right? The First Amendment, right? Guarantees us the right, amongst other things, right? The press, right? but guarantees us these things. And so absolutely, but yet more still. What I mean by structural change, I don't just mean everyday individuals, though we do have a responsibility to the democracy, to the republic. What I mean is stakeholders who claim to want change. If you want change, right? Like if you are at the top of a business and you point to unconscious bias training, as opposed to making structural changes in your racist, sexist, whateverist corporation, then you're not pushing towards change. You're just trying to absolve and make yourself feel good, right? Like that's the frustration I think I have with unconscious bias training. It suggests that within an hour of training, we can all be great. And that's just not how it's going to work, right? Like, look, I personally I don't care if people don't like me because I'm Black. That does not bother me. What bothers me is that you try and destroy my livability. That's it. You have the right to go home and say, I don't like that Black guy. That's your right. I think it's a foolish choice because I think I'm a wonderful guy, but I think it's your right. You don't have a right to destroy my life.
But I'm curious.
I need access to the labor market, to the education market. You don't have the right to do that. And that is structural change. That's a different kind of engagement.
Dr. Marks talked about this being a process of changing behavior. I'm curious, just to the panel, anyone feel like this is part of that process and that process might have inched a little bit more ahead?
It could, right? Like it could, but there's a whole book out there called Racism Without Racists, because benevolent people still can do damaging acts because it benefits them structurally to do damaging acts. This, again, I'm going to keep going back. People choose to be racist because it benefits them. That's kind of it, right? Like we want to believe like this great person couldn't do such a thing. We do everyday problematic acts because we choose to do them because it benefits us. That's kind of it, right? And so sure, for many people, it might lead to some sort of introspection, right? I imagine unconscious bias testing and discussions lead people, like I think, was it Doreen who said earlier, like, oh my God, this perfect, wonderful, but it does little to nothing to train out biases. In fact, biases is a part of everyday human interaction. We all have them, good, bad, or otherwise. It's just the thing that we do, right? Again, I can have a bias about who I don't like, but I cannot destroy your livability because of said bias, because Black people don't have the structural sort of power to do such a thing.
But how do you feel about that? I want to get some other people's opinions. We've been having a lot of dialogue right now. Do you agree? Do you disagree?
Well, coming from my perspective, what's really kind of top of mind for me right now from the Asian American community, this whole, Asian hate and real things that are happening out there, right? Perspectives that people have against Asian Americans that lead them to attack them, blatantly, things that are happening in real life that's really hurting people in my community. And I feel like having this conversation is important. Maybe it's not the training, but just talking about it and have people think about, maybe stop for a second. Maybe they've never met an Asian American person. Maybe they've never been around this circle of people and they have a certain perspectives, right? So I think it's so important for people to step back and say, this is going to affect this conversation that Channel 13 put out there. It's going to affect all of us in many different ways. It's going to affect Javon in a different way that it affects Vita and me and Peter and Ruben. We're not all going to take this the same way. And everybody has different levels of how they understand this subject, So I think it's important for us to be open to see how people are taking in this conversation. And that's what I think we're doing here. And I wanted to put it out there for Todd and Alicia to talk a little bit about why it's important that you guys are doing this. I think people who are watching you and turning to Channel 13 and say, okay, why are you putting this conversation out there? Is it to show that you are thinking about this in your coverage and who you're talking to? Is that why we're here as a panel to share this conversation with you? So I think I'd be interested to hear what you guys are thinking about this and why you're putting out there on TV.
Well, I can go first. I think this topic is a part of my civilization. It's about my passion. It's been in my heart for years. I feel a lot of points that Javon said just about, when you disrupt my ability to succeed in my career or purchase a home, you're messing with me, and I have to stand up for that. I don't care that you don't like the color of my skin. And I feel like as a journalist, I have a duty to speak up for those that don't have a voice. And right now, I feel like there's an attack, and there has been an attack on Black and brown people, period. That's how I feel. And I feel like I need to give a voice to that community. And I am so proud of KTNV for giving me this platform and for really taking diversity to the next level here at KTNV.
Definitely.
Yeah, and I agree. Just from a pure journalism standpoint, this is certainly such an important topic. And for me personally, my grandfather was born and raised in Puerto Rico, but my mother is Irish and Norwegian. So throughout my life, I've walked through, different worlds depending on the audience. So this has been a part of my life story, trying to figure some of this stuff out myself. And so to be able to have the opportunity to do this and be a part of this discussion, it is important. And I'm curious, and sort of going back to trying to understand with Peter and Javon, what you guys are talking about with a degree of bias versus racism. What I'm hearing from you is that you feel that the two are really vastly different, and that bias is something that we all have, but racism and the sort of activation of racism needs to be addressed in a totally different way. But you don't think there's any connection between bias to eventually improving racism, or you don't? It's a bridge too far.
Well, not that there's no connection. That all the major studies have shown that the connection is little at best.
Very little.
And I'm going off the research, right? Like I'm an academic. I'm a professor. I literally take the smartest research and I go, all right, this is what the research is suggesting, right? But even back to Petrania, am I saying that correctly? Petrania's point earlier about the sort of current anti-Asian hate. We must not divorce that from former president who called it the Chinese virus. We must not also divorce that structural. We must not also divorce that from the ways in which the US has always imagined the East as always backwards, as always a static and back then, and always underdeveloped and always in needing of an Asian other to push itself up against. This is part, it's not just bias. These are long structural institutions that make such hate possible, that make such violence against certain people possible. And if we're not addressing that, if we think it's assuming, and I'm going to counter you a bit here, Petrania, it's not as simple as I need to meet some folk. We watched Tom Brady play football with African Americans for decades and donned a MAGA hat. It's structural. I don't know how else to say that. But so what happens is it's with these trainings, again, not the discussions. The discussions are fantastic. Let's have them. Yes, right? The trainings, it places the responsibility of racism as a system onto a few bad actors. And if we just solve for them, everything will be okay. But it does nothing to solve for the problematic system that ensures certain people are in certain are in troubling scenarios for themselves.
And Todd, you're a friend, and so I know your heart, and I know you. This probably is a little bit shocking to you, right? That maybe some of us don't believe that connection exists, but this is hard stuff. This is really hard work. I mean, look at Hispanics. We're 2.7 trillion with a T. $trillion of the American economy. We are the American economy. And in Nevada, 17 billion. We are the economy in Nevada. You can't reopen the strip without Latinas. Yet we're not essential. Yet we're not getting vaccinated at the same rate they are in Summerlin. That's the reality. Those are big structural changes that must happen, that are bigger than a conversation. They just are bigger than a training. And, it upsets me. It does. It pisses me off. COVID is highlighting it more than ever.
Yeah, no, Peter, we do go back, and I always appreciate your perspective and your expertise. And you're right. It's very interesting to hear your reaction to this, because I watched it and I had a different reaction, and this isn't about my expertise. But to me, I thought there was something to this that had some meat on the bones, something that we could take and in our own lives have conversations with friends or family. But you're right, not in a sort of structural way. I'm not going to go to Clark County commissioners with this, but I am going to sit down maybe eventually when we can go back to a bar or restaurant and have conversations with friends and family. And I do feel like, having watched Dr. Marks, I have come away with an awareness that I previously didn't have. And to me, I understand that's a small, maybe nothing even degree of change, but to me, it's something definitively concrete.
No,
Does
and
anyone
it's
else
big.
feel that same way?
And it's big. I mean, this may not be a big, huge structural change, but in terms of journalism, in terms of a local news program doing something like this is a huge moment. And that can't be minimized. It's got to be congratulated and celebrated at your station, no doubt about it. But we are having a conversation about reality, and the reality says, we need bigger changes. It's time already. We can't keep going the way we're going, or this thing's going to really implode.
Well, I appreciate that. I mean, aside from this conversation, but for you to invite, us members of, Latin American, Indian American, Thai American, Chinese American to all sit down together. I think that's important, to always bring those perspectives up, and to elevate that. And like what Dr. Marks is talking about of, white being the norm or something like that. So I think that needs to be our everyday top of mind. Maybe it's not going to change things today or tomorrow, but I think in the long term, I think this is important to kind of elevate all those perspectives.
I want to switch gears for a minute and go back in time 10 months ago during the murder of George Floyd. Do you feel like, and I'm going to direct this to Vita first, do you feel like there's been a change in attitude in America? Do you see a change since his death?
I see the change in the last few years. So I think what we need to do is, I noticed that when the whole thing happened, they were pinning the people of color against each other, which I find very that we shouldn't do. What we should do is come together, and the Asian American throughout this United States all came together to show support and be part of that, right? So I want to make sure that we always remember to come together and not pin each other against each other. And I find that we do that quite often. We pin the Asian against the blacks or the Latino against it, and we shouldn't. We should all bring the people of color together and work on this issue together. So I think one thing we talked about earlier is like the training does not work. Why are you training something that's going on, right? Discussion is great. Conversations are great. But the word, I guess, training, trying to train us not to be a certain way makes no sense. And I understand what Dr. Johnson was talking about. So that's my input.
Ruben, let me ask you, because I know you are so hands-on with your students at Rancho, and you talk a lot about racism and what happened with George Floyd. Do you feel like, I mean, how was that, just digesting that for the last 10 months? And were there new conversations being brought up that you haven't had in the past?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll say two things. One, there were some heated conversations in my class, especially of the year, when the school year first started, revolving around race. It was something that the students all had an opinion on. They all had something to say, and oftentimes it got difficult to control. We had a virtual sort of class environment that was going on, and some of the things just got outright nasty. I'll just be real, and I had to intervene many times. Students were saying very inappropriate things to one another, and it for sure is something that the kids were talking about. That is without a doubt. There's nothing that's going to make me believe that the students are not at least thinking and having these conversations within themselves or amongst themselves regarding this issue. The other thing that I'll say, and this also goes to the larger conversation we're having here about structural change and whether some sort of a moment in history can create structural change or opportunity for structural change. I've been paying attention to the legislative session this year. It's ongoing right now. It's taking place as we are speaking, and there's a lot of conversation in those committee hearings and stuff about what took place this summer, about the Black Lives Matter movement, about a renewed focus on minorities and especially Black Americans and the issues that are pertaining to these communities. You have bills, some very and some people have said are like strong. I think they're strong in the right way, dealing with housing. You have AB 141, AB 161 that deal with evictions, and that also deal with notifying folks who are about to be evicted. And we know that a large segment disproportionately is Black and brown folks who are being affected by these issues. You have bills that deal with bail reform, bills that are dealing with equity in education. So these are I think a direct, and they're saying to the folks who are bringing these bills to committee that this is a direct causation now of what took place this summer. So I think there is some hope there. And lastly, I'll say this before I end. I'm somebody who believes in movements. I identify myself on the more progressive side of politics. But one of my big things has always been with the moment equating to social change and social action is how long is that action sustained? Like everybody's really riled up, for a moment, and then everybody's talking about the issue. Everybody wants to is fired up about change and reform. But then when the rubber meets the road, so to speak, there's not as many people there who are taking part in the actual creation of this policy. We're having I'm working on the AB 141, which deals with housing reform. And there are folks who I'm having a difficult time to even show up and participate in a committee hearing where we need to hear from people who are being affected by eviction or being affected by bail reform. So I think there is an opportunity at least for some real reform to take place. I find it, difficult sometimes to get that same level of energy involved in the actual decision making and the policy making process itself.
So I'm wondering, in the wake of George Floyd, and all of you in some capacity or another are involved in trying to change, and actually, structural change we're talking about in terms of racism. Have you seen those wheels begin to turn more now than you did a year ago, or you feel like it's still the same slow slog?
I'll jump in then. I'm kind of a both yes and no. So yes, in the sense that many people are trying to do many of the same things that we've always have done, right? Let's have a committee and have more discussions, as if we haven't had discussions for decades now, right? But discussions are necessary, and I want to be clear on that, right? Let's do the unconscious bias training and assume that that's the solve. When, as the perfect example would be, even Dr. Mark said, he's trained, did he say thousands of cops? And yet we do not see a decline in Black death. They don't work. And I think we have to admit that. So part of it is, I see a lot of the same things because they're easy to point to. I don't see the kind of systemic structural change that we need to make necessary for a different kind of world, a more shared, a more caring, and a more loving world, one that isn't selfish and just about me and mine, but one that thinks about collective living, about what does it mean that we share this planet together. Right. And that takes a different kind of framing and a different kind of relationship to pretty much every structure that exists, that we have, that we operate in. So in some ways, I see more conversations. I see more trainings, but I'm not seeing more of these structural changes that I think need to take place in order for us to say that we're turning turning a leaf, if you will.
Yeah, Peter, I'm curious.
Dr. Johnson, thing here, I think we need, I'm sorry. I think we need to get this to the stakeholders, right? He said, we want to get to the people who will make that decision for structural change. How do we make those people, have that aha moment that Dr. Mark said? How do we get them to understand and see and make that change up for the top? And I think the conversation needs to start everywhere, including right here. And hopefully those people will hear it and things will start changing and make a difference. I mean, it's tough. I don't think it's going to be an easy change, but we need to talk about it and be more inclusive to all perspectives that are being put out there.
Peter, a lot of the movers and shakers here in Nevada. I'm curious to get your take. Have you seen a change?
Marginally, not as much as we should have, but that doesn't shock me. I watched some of the protests and the burning things down and all that, and I know that a lot of young folks were maybe hopeful that was going to create big structural change. But you know what? That it didn't create much structural change, because the people that are holding on to that power up here are holding on a little tighter. And so until we get that loosened up, we can burn our own businesses down in our own communities as a protest. I don't see that really affecting, the presidents and CEOs of big companies, where wealth and loans and dollars, we're talking money. We're talking access to capital. No, I don't see much happening there.
What do you see as a potential avenue to create this change? I mean, it is a massive undertaking. It is something that clearly we have not figured out. What is it going to take?
Gosh, I guess that's going to take a deep conversation. I don't know if I'm really prepared for it. Obviously education, self-esteem issues. There's so many issues that affect, young Latinos realizing that when they do, if they're fortunate enough to be successful and get money, the first thing they want to do is run away from the neighborhood. I get that. I'm trying to teach some of them to reinvest that dollars in the neighborhoods so that we can start trying to develop some generational wealth. So we all try to do our part, and maybe it's working, maybe it's not. But I do know that to end some of this stuff is going to take huge structural changes. I keep saying that.
Ruben, go ahead. A thought on that.
Yeah. There's, I think this brings to mind and I don't want to be too much of a pessimist. I'm an optimistic person, to be honest with you, and that's who I am, bottom line. And I'm pretty sure that Professor Johnson is familiar with this thesis too that was posited, a few years back. This is the late 2010s, late 2000s, early 2010s, and that was a 2045 thesis. This understanding that in the year 2045, Caucasians, white Americans are going to be no longer going to be the majority in this country. And there's an individual, the Reverend Tyrone Mcgowan, a Morehouse graduate. He was the chief of staff for the Rainbow Push Coalition, Jesse Jackson's organization in Chicago, and he's also on the pastor staff at the Trinity United in Chicago. And I went to one of his talks, and he had this, and it really hit me because he kind of said this. He said that as the country becomes more pluralistic and becomes less white in many ways, that there's going to be a great deal of pushback against that. There are people who hold great positions of power in the economy, in politics, who don't want to see themselves as a group, even as a race, lose power. And he said that this is again around 2011 now, 2012, that the 2020s were going to be some of the most violent and unstable decades going to the 2030s when it came to race in America. He said that it's simply because of demography. And when I saw what happened, in this election, the 2020 election, the riots this summer, and then also the storming of the Capitol, that kicked off the year 2020. It's something that his lecture I rekindled myself to that conversation that we had, and he was making an argument based upon demography. And I don't know, maybe a Professor Johnson would like to also point some things out here or correct me where I'm wrong. That there is going to be a degree of destabilization, some very difficult times when it comes to race in America because of the change in demography. The argument again being that by the year 2045, America is no longer going to be a white majority nation. There are going to be other groups, particularly Hispanics, that are going to make up a large segment of the population, and that as we get to that point, there's going to be problems, and there's going to be a lot of tensions amongst the races. We're going to see.
It's definitely going to be Hispanics. I just had Dr. Batista from UCLA, who gave the studies, showed the statistics. We're having babies, and everybody else is not. That's a fact. And it's interesting that I just saw a study come out from some environmentalists who now are saying babies are the worst thing to happen to the climate. And man, I'm telling you, there's somebody's behind saying that.
So really quickly, can I, Peter? The idea that we're overpopulated is actually a fundamental misnomer. It's not true at all. It was actually born out of the eugenicist movement and out of a fear of whiteness. So a fear of whiteness losing its power. Like, science knows that, academics know that. Yep. We are not an overpopulated country. Exactly. That is just not the truth at all. Or world for that matter. But to point back to Ruben's sort of thesis that I think is really important here, I would argue is that this country has always had difficult racial moments, right? Mm-hmm. And we got to be honest about that. And in order for me to really explain that, we don't really have the time, but I would have to explain how race functions, how whiteness was actually created, right? Because the other thing is true, is that race didn't always exist. It's actually a relatively new invention in the course of human history. Right? In that it was born from racism. So racism actually birthed race, right? But the point that I'm making is we could look to the early 20th century when white men were fearful that they were going to lose power because Jack Johnson, well, not just because, but Jack Johnson becomes the symbolism of black male strength and what white men are losing. And then that got voracious and violent. And I mean, I could keep going on. There was always a moment in the US history where white folks are feeling like they're losing power and respond with violence. So this is actually not a new thing, but it's actually a long and consistent thing that we could point to actual moments in history. The rebirth of the Confederate flag was born quite literally during the Civil Rights era, when Black people said, "I would like to vote and have more rights." Right. So, like, I can keep going on with evidence after evidence. We saw an uptick of Asian violence in the 80s because of, you guessed it, car manufacturers being shipped over into Asia, and we lose the Model T Ford line. And so we see that. We saw an uptick in violence in brown folk, and we start worrying about the border and immigration when that was really just hatred for Latinx people, if we're just being honest. So that's always been a thing, and it will continually be a thing until we address it, you guessed it, structurally.
And Dr. Johnson, let me be clear. I took that study of the overpopulation and babies are no good for the climate, and I flushed it down the toilet, because to me it was planned. It was a planned study to do the opposite of what I believe in, and I'm glad that Latinos, we're having babies.
Yeah, let me just jump in real quick. I know in the onset we said this was going to be about an hour-long discussion. Right now it's 8:56. I think we probably want to wrap it up right around 9 o'clock. I just want to sort of give the early 5-minute warning here. If there's some thoughts or some places that maybe you feel like we need to go that we didn't hit on, please, feel free to bring that up. Ruben, you have your hand raised.
That's old. I'm sorry about that. I'll take that down.
Ruben thought he was back in class.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would probably just say this. I could. Again, mine is not a refusal of the conversation. The conversation is necessary, but I don't want the conversation to be considered a panacea. At best, the conversation is just a really good conversation that might potentially lead to something, but there is no evidence that proves that. What leads to something is a demand for structural change. The biggest political shifts that we've had in this country were because people demanded structural change. It wasn't enlightened men who decided to give first white women the right to vote, then other women to follow. That was women who demanded the right to vote. It really is that simple. History has shown us what we need to do, and we don't need to shy away from that. And this isn't about having a cordial conversation. It's literally demanding structural change that says, look, you can hate me if you want. You do not get to destroy my life and my livability because of that hate. End of story.
And I know race is important, and we've been kind of focusing the conversation on that, but we're talking about diversity and implicit bias. It covers a lot of grounds, right? Not just race, not just gender. It covers a lot of characteristics that people are watching right now and thinking that top of mind for them, maybe not for us, but maybe for them. So I think we need to think of a big scope of our community who are watching this and thinking about what needs to be addressed, what's important for them. And I think we need to put it out there as more than just race and gender.
And I think, listen, great, well-meaning folks are watching this, and obviously there's some good that comes out of dialogue and conversations. I mean, I think good things come out of that. And so I don't want to minimize what we did here today and what your station did today. I think it's to be commended.
And good things, when I hear that came out, I take that in light of our conversation as good things in our neighborhood. Maybe there are people who are black, white, brown, or different that maybe now we're not so fearful to engage. But when you talk about big change, this, what Dr. Marks was talking about, goes nowhere near that territory. Am I understanding that separation?
That's part two.
That's part two. Honestly, a whole different topic, right? Like I don't think unconscious bias training can get at the things that would really lead to big change. It leads at best to conversations about our biases. And that's what all of the studies suggest, that if we talk about our biases in this training, we'll talk about our biases, and that's kind of it.
I think that there's great conversations still to be had. You know, like I'm older than a lot of folks, so I often wonder: is this new technology where my nephew really doesn't want to be around other people? He likes being in his room on his computer, and is that going to help bring us together? Is that dividing us? So I think there's a lot of conversations and a lot of subjects that we need to have.
Well, this has been another interesting conversation. I think for me personally, among the better ones we've had, it has been difficult, if not awkward at points, but that's okay. I think that's where we all got to, feel more comfortable in that space as we all learn. And I thank you all again for your time and your expertise and your courage and your willingness to talk about these issues. So thank you again.
Thank you all, and good night. And you'll hear more from everyone on this panel. I hope you'll stay with us.
Thank you, guys. I appreciate each one of you guys. Really do.
Thank you.
We can be.
Thank you.
Step Ruben.